They called him Gustav, a crocodile so massive and deadly that he had become a legend in the villages along the banks of the Ruzizi River in Burundi. Gustav wasn't just any crocodile. He was a killer, an apex predator said to have taken over 300 lives. I first heard about him during a wildlife research project in East Africa. My name is Dr. Samuel Varga, and I specialize in studying predator behavior. Gustav fascinated me. Witnesses spoke of his immense size, estimated at over 20 feet long, and his horrifying hunting tactics. He didn't kill for survival alone. He killed indiscriminately. Villagers told me stories of him dragging entire boats under, of bodies pulled into the murky water, never to be seen again. They spoke of his scars, deep gouges along his scales from bullets and machetes that had failed to stop him. Some believed he was more than an animal, a demon, a spirit of vengeance haunting the river. I didn't believe in spirits, but when I set out with my guide, Michael, to find him, I couldn't shake a growing sense of dread. We spent days on the river, scanning its surface. The locals wouldn't come with us. "He senses fear," one old man warned. On the third evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, we saw him. At first it was just the faint ripple of water. Then his head emerged, huge, with eyes that seemed to glint with malice. "He's watching us," Michael whispered. We stayed still, barely breathing. Gustav floated closer, his sheer size dwarfing our small boat. I raised my camera to document him, but the flash startled him. With a surge of power, he disappeared beneath the surface. Seconds later, the boat rocked violently. A sickening crunch followed as his massive jaws clamped down on the side. "Go!" Michael screamed as we tried to paddle to shore. The boat tilted, water rushing in. Gustav hit us again, his tail slamming into the hull like a battering ram. Michael fell into the water. His scream was cut short as he was dragged under. Blood pooled in the water, and I froze, helpless, as Gustav surfaced again, holding Michael's lifeless body in his jaws. He tossed it like a rag doll before disappearing with his prize. I made it to shore, trembling and soaked. Villagers found me hours later, sitting in silence by the river. I told them what I had seen, but they only nodded. "We warned you," one man said grimly. "Gustav doesn't just kill, he enjoys it." To this day, Gustav remains at large, a monster lurking in the depths. Some say he's immortal, a force of nature that cannot be stopped. I know one thing for certain, he's out there, waiting, and the river will never be safe as long as Gustav rules its waters.
I've been an air traffic controller for 22 years. I've guided hundreds of flights safely through storms, emergencies, and everything in between. But I'll never forget Flight 702. It was a routine evening shift. The weather was calm, just a blanket of low-hanging clouds stretching across the horizon. Flight 702, a commercial jet bound for Seattle, was cruising at 35,000 feet. The pilot's voice over the radio was calm, almost bored. "Seattle Center, this is 702, cruising steady, no issues." "Copy that, 702. You're clear through your current path. Let us know if anything changes," I replied. Everything was normal, until it wasn't. At 8:17 p.m., the radar flagged an anomaly. Flight 702, which had been moving steadily along its flight path, flickered on the screen. Just for a second, a blip. "702, this is Seattle Center. We're showing a slight disruption on your signal. Everything okay up there?" Silence. "702, do you copy?" The radar flickered again, and the plane's signal disappeared entirely. I've dealt with signal loss before. It usually lasts a few seconds, but when a full minute passed with no response, my chest tightened. "Flight 702, respond immediately." The radio crackled, and then faintly, "Seattle Center." The voice was strained, barely audible, like someone whispering through a bad connection. "702, your signal's weak. Say again." There was a pause, and then, "The clouds. It's not." Static swallowed the rest. I called for backup and tried reaching the pilot again, but there was nothing. The radar still showed no trace of the plane. The minutes stretched into hours. Emergency protocols were initiated. We alerted nearby flights, ground crews, and search teams. But it was as if Flight 702 had simply vanished. 3 days later, I was called into a debrief. The wreckage hadn't been found, but there was something else, something they wouldn't explain at first. Eventually, one of the investigators handed me an audio recording. "It's the last transmission from 702, he said, his face pale. I listened. "The clouds? It's not the sky. Something's in here. The voice cracked, frantic now. They're not people. Oh God, there. The recording cut off abruptly, but not before a sound like screaming, not from one person, but a chorus of voices filled the air. I couldn't sleep after that. Every time I close my eyes, I see that radar screen, that blip flickering out of existence. I hear the panic in the pilot's voice, and worse, the screams. Flight 702 was officially declared lost. But I know what I heard. Something was waiting in those clouds. And whatever it was, it took them. Now, every time I see a plane enter the clouds, I wonder if it'll come back.
My name is Elias, and I've always scoffed at old legends. Growing up in a small alpine village, Christmas was both magical and terrifying. The elders told tales of Krampus, the horned creature who punished the wicked during the season of joy. We dismissed it as folklore, but deep down we all feared the shadows of winter nights. This Christmas, I returned to the village for the first time in years. My father had passed, and his old house felt colder than I remembered. Snow blanketed the streets, and the scent of pine filled the air. But something was different this year. Doors were bolted shut before sundown, and no one walked the streets after dusk. At dinner, my aunt leaned in and whispered, "You should leave offerings tonight, Elias." "Offerings," I smirked, thinking it was another old superstition. "For Krampus," she replied, her voice trembling. "This year feels wrong." I brushed it off as paranoia and went for a walk after dark. The village square, once festive with lights and carolers, was silent. Snow crunched underfoot, and the air was so still it felt suffocating. Then I heard it, a faint jingling, like bells. It came from the woods beyond the square. I froze. "Hello?" I called out, my breath forming clouds in the icy air. The bells grew louder, accompanied by a low, guttural growl. My heartbeat quickened as a tall, shadowy figure emerged from the tree line. Its body was hunched, covered in matted fur, with curling horns that seemed to scrape the sky. In its clawed hand it held a sack that writhed as though something inside was alive. "Elias," the creature rasped, its voice like cracking ice. I stumbled backward. How do you know my name?" It didn't answer. Instead, it tossed the sack to the ground. The contents spilled out, broken toys, charred pieces of wood, and my father's scarf. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. The creature's grotesque face twisted into a grin. "He thought he could hide from me. You should have left the offerings, Elias." Before I could run, the sack flew toward me, pulling me into its suffocating darkness. Inside, I could hear the cries of others, trapped and forgotten. Now, when the villagers speak of Krampus, they warn of a man who didn't believe, and who paid the price. My name is Elias, and I know the truth. Krampus doesn't come just for the wicked. He comes for those who doubt.
My name's Vincent, and I've made a living breaking into places no one else dares to. Abandoned houses, crumbling mansions, they're treasure troves for people like me. But the old manor on the edge of town? That was different. It had been empty for decades. Locals whispered about its last owner, a reclusive man obsessed with collecting rare artifacts. They called him the Collector, and his death was as mysterious as his life. I didn't care about the stories. I cared about the rumors of valuables left behind. The night I broke in, the air felt heavy, as though the house itself was alive. My flashlight illuminated dust-covered furniture, cobwebbed chandeliers, and walls lined with paintings. But it wasn't the art that caught my eye. It was the display cases. Inside were relics, ancient masks, jeweled daggers, and oddly enough, personal items like watches and necklaces. Each had a small plaque beneath it with a name engraved. The longer I stayed, the more uneasy I felt. The house was silent, but the kind of silence that hums in your ears. I grabbed a silver locket, thinking it would fetch a decent price, and stuffed it in my bag. That's when I heard it. "Vincent." The voice was low, almost a whisper, but it sent chills down my spine. I spun around, shining my flashlight into the darkness. No one was there. "Vincent." The voice came again, this time from deeper in the house. My heart raced as I backed toward the door. The floor creaked under my boots, but the sound wasn't just beneath me. It was all around, like footsteps coming from every direction. "Return it," the voice demanded, louder now. I turned to run, but froze when I saw the paintings on the walls. The figures had moved. Their eyes, once looking out at distant landscapes, were now staring directly at me. Their mouths, once closed, were twisted into snarls. "Thief!" they hissed in unison. I dropped the locket and bolted. The front door wouldn't budge, and the windows were sealed shut. The air grew colder, and the voice boomed, "You will join them." Suddenly, I was yanked backward, my body dragged across the floor. I screamed, clawing at the hardwood, but invisible hands pulled me into a room filled with empty frames. The last thing I saw was my reflection in the glass of a frame. Then, darkness. They found my body weeks later, but not where I expected. A new painting now hangs in the manor, a portrait of a terrified man, forever trapped, with a silver locket in his hand.